Questionable Ethics, Chapter 10, Less Than Desirable Consequences, Part 1. I sat upon my stone, and I watched the fire crackle away as I thought of how I wanted to start this conversation. It was quiet amongst the group. Nobody said a word. They all just looked at me, with worried eyes, even though I hadn't told them anything yet. I talked to Autumn to hell and back, yet now, here I sat, silently contemplating what I was about to say. My words were failing me. A greater part of me wishes I had just kept my mouth shut about that wretched place, that I should have ignored the symbol on the bottom of the radio. But another part of me said that eventually I was going to have to tell Autumn, and maybe even Rainshine, about the things that I've done. It was inevitable. Whether it be tomorrow or next week, I was going to have to tell them the truth. But, for some reason, my mind had made the decision to tell them now, and had stalled enough. It was time to spill the beans. I looked up from the fire at the 5 Kirin, and gently nodded my head in acceptance. It was now or never. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Right, here goes nothing, I said with a now very heavy heart. Back on Earth, and within my country, there is a sub-territory called the state of New Mexico. For context, my country is made up of 50 of these states. And within this state is a place called Black Mesa. It's a research facility. That's the size of a large town. Yes, I'm aware that's a pretty big ballpark estimate, but I think I'm right in assuming that, I began to say. Petrus popped up and spoke quickly. Is it bigger than Perilous Peaks? He asked quickly. I looked at him and nodded. Oh, it's way bigger. Bigger than you could ever imagine. The absolute scale of that place was astonishing. Truly a modern marvel. The Kirin turned their heads around and looked at their meager village just beyond the trees. They then turned back to me with a look of bewilderment on their faces. Anyway, the place was employed by thousands of people, a great number of which were scientists. Thus why it was a research facility. Of course, it wasn't just scientists. There were security guards, maintenance people, warehouse workers, and God knows how many more people working in the background. All I know for sure is that there were thousands of them, and they all lived where they worked. Security guards lived in the barracks, scientists lived in dormitories, and other people that maintained the facility lived in base housing surrounding the complex. One of the Kirin spoke up. So they, lived where they worked? Did they have families? Could they live with them? It was Autumn Blaze. I sat on that question for a minute. I then turned to her and nodded. Yeah, I would assume they had families. They either lived with them on base or they lived far apart from one another. The reason behind this was that Black Mesa was a top-secret facility, thus why people lived on-site or around it. I can only assume they had rarely left the state. It was so that they could isolate themselves from the outside world, I stated. Petrus chirped up again. Why was it top secret? He asked. I knew I couldn't tell him too much, but at the same time, it really didn't matter anymore. Black Mesa was gone after all, or at least I thought so. Black Mesa was funded by the government, for the government and private organizations to design, test, and construct tons of secret black projects that could help forward mankind into a new era of understanding and scientific marvels. Everything they did for the greater good, and for understanding the greater cosmos at large. They put humanity first always, and if that meant jeopardizing their safety in the process, then so be it. They were selfless and brave in their line of work. That's why it was so secretive, because my government didn't want its top secret scientists and technology falling into the wrong hands. Petrus nodded and pondered for a moment before looking at me again. I continued. While Black Mesa was in operation, the men and women in their labs with their theories in science managed to develop their own form of teleportation technology, among other things. This was their magnum opus, the ability to travel from point A to point B almost instantaneously, was what they were good at. Sarika suddenly spoke up. Hey, we can teleport with magic. We can do it almost effortlessly, she boldly stated. Did the humans use magic as well? She asked, leaning in a bit closer to me. I shook my head. No, humans can't use magic. We use technology. I'm not sure how it worked, but those scientists sure managed to do it, and they did it well enough that they impressed the government. All of this science was created with the intent to secure funding to help them along their way so they could understand the world they lived on, and the worlds around them. The Kirin leaned back and hummed, tapping her hoof onto her chin. She then looked back to me with a shrug. Anyway, Black Mesa was in the pocket of the US government. They made science, and they got money. It was a simple system until I stopped for a moment and glanced off into the fire. I stared at it as the flames licked away at the open air. I then spoke again, but this time I felt a bit worse than I did when I started. It was as if someone had grabbed my stomach and twisted it. There was an accident. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what happened. I was never really told, and I never got a straight answer out of anybody I asked. The term Resonance Cascade was thrown around a lot between the members of my platoon, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter what it was called, nor did I care. What happened at Black Mesa was madness. I couldn't even begin to describe to you how deep into hell Black Mesa descended into that day. The official story was something had gone wrong in Sector C. Test laboratories and a rift in time and space had been ripped open after a failed test sample was loaded into an analysis machine. Lots of high-ranking officials said that Sector C was sabotaged by this one scientist. I then took a moment to stare off, remembering back to my first moments at Black Mesa. The chaos that ensued as our air assault group got within range of our landing zone. The bodies of the Marines that had died in the Osprey crash, the aliens shooting electricity from their hands and crawling into other Marines' flesh, the sound of screaming and gunfire from all sides as bullets whizzed about with no sense of order. It made me freeze up with fear. I could still remember my first steps on the ground before I got knocked out from a grenade that went off near me. It was hell. I then felt the hoof on my shoulder. Adrian, you alright? You've been staring at the fire for quite a bit now. We can stop if you would like. You don't need to say any more if you don't want to. It was Autumn. The same mare that rips into me with questions every chance she gets was now looking into me with a pair of humongous sad eyes. That I had no choice but to stare back into. The fire was illuminating her face in just the right way to make her seem like she was more than just a horse or a Kirin, like she was something much greater than that. I looked down to the hoof, and I raised a hand up to it. I wrapped my fingers around it, and I held on to it for a moment, now staring at the hoof. I don't think I've ever really felt anything like this before. physically or emotionally. Ever since Black Mesa, it was the way she looked at me, and the way she spoke now compared to her normal self. It wasn't like the way that she had acted before. I felt safe with her near me. I felt like I could open up. Yeah, sorry. I just sort of lost my train of thought. She took her hoof from my shoulder, and I watched it go, as if I didn't want it to leave. She leaned back and returned to listening to me again. Right, so where was I? Right, so anyway, the military adopted the notion that the facility had been sabotaged by a man going by the name of Dr. Gordon Freeman. He was a scientist just like everyone else in the complex, but because he was at Ground Zero, they figured he was the one that did the dirty deed of destroying the place. Me, on the other hand, not so much, but I'll get into that later. To make a long story slightly less long, I took a deep breath and reoriented myself in my seat. So, what had happened was the facility had a containment breach. Aliens from another world called Zen, and some others from who knows where, were teleporting in all over the facility. The people there sent out a distress beacon saying that they were scared and in dire need of help. To set things right, they needed help to shut down the source of all the portals and put an end to the alien invasion. I then paused again, almost like I was asking for Autumn to come closer again, but instead, I thundered on with my explanation. So, they call us, United States government, to send the Hazardous Environment Combat Unit, 1st Battalion, to the facility to help the scientists with the invasion and assist them in bringing the facility back under control. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared us for this situation of this magnitude. I mean, we had trained about a scenario like this before back in Arizona on our military base, Fort Santiago. In fact, we had trained for a situation like this as if it was going to happen eventually. Like it wasn't a matter of if it was going to happen, only when. Which to me was a bit suspicious, but the training didn't help. I then stood up from my rock and began to slowly pace back and forth. The Kirin watched me as I strode in front of the fire. And so, I told them everything. I told them about the lies and the conspiracies of Black Mesa Research Facility. I told them about Zen and the aliens from beyond. I told them about the mistreatment of science personnel by fellow Marines while I condemned it. I detailed the bombing of the surface and the premature evacuation of only 2 days of fighting. I told them about the people I met along the way, security guards, scientists, fellow Marines, and the rest. I told them about the toxic waste and the safety hazards, and most importantly, I told them how much of a shit show the whole thing was. So all of this, it was like a war with these aliens, huh? Fern asks as I sit back down onto my rock. I looked to her and looked to the others. They all wore the same faces of frightened bewilderment and shock. I then shook my head. I've seen war before, and this wasn't war. I was deployed to Kiwat during the first Gulf War against Saddam's army. That was a war. It had a clear goal and a clear enemy. I had to fight. Black Mesa, however, wasn't a war. It was a massacre. I then froze and stared down at my hands that had gone limp onto my lap. I stare at the ground, remembering everything I could. How was it a massacre? Why was it a massacre? Zakaratra asks. I didn't know how to respond. I left out the detail that I knew would condemn me to hell in the eyes of those Kirin. I left out the one fact that was the hardest to explain. I left out the fact that we weren't sent there to bring the facility under control. We were sent there to kill anyone associated with the project and silence any witnesses. And while I sat here, staring at the ground, unsure how to answer, I heard Autumn speaking. I wasn't sure what she was saying, but I knew she could see my state of mind. She knew that answering that question was clearly too hard for me. I guessed she was telling Sketra and the others that maybe they didn't need to know. But they did. They did need to know. They needed to know the truth of what happened. They need to see it my way, because I know what happened. I know how all these pieces fitted together. I looked up to see the Kieran getting ready to leave. I then quickly spoke as I shoot back up into a proper sitting position. No. I'll tell you why it was a massacre. Because it's important. It's important because you all need to know what lengths a government will go to in the name of national security. Autumn turns, hearing my voice again. She went to interject, but I put my hand up, which silenced her. I then motioned for her to sit, and as she did, the others follow her example and return to the ground around the fire. It was a massacre because I took a deep breath and exhaled while clearing my throat. It felt like I was choking on these words. Because our orders weren't to save people. Our orders were to silence the facility and neutralize every employee at Black Mesa, to keep the Resonance Cascade accident a secret, as to not let the existence of that base leak to the public. Our orders were to leave no man standing and bring Dr. Gordon Freeman in for questioning, as he was suspected to be the person behind all of this. Our secondary objective was to kill the aliens that were teleporting in and re-stabilize the area until further notice. And just like that, I couldn't hear the fire anymore. Its existence was voided to me. I looked up from the flames and around at the Kieran. They now stared at me with faces of pure shock and terror. Their mouths were left agape, and their eyes had shrunken into their skulls out of fear. It was clear to me now that they had never heard nor experienced anything like this in their lives. A shaky voice spoke up after this silence had grown too strong. Adrian, please tell me you're joking. I looked over at where the voice had came from, and it was Autumn, whom of which was just now becoming afraid of me, knowing what kinds of deed I had done against my own kind. Even when we first met, she had not feared me. She was the only one besides Rainshine who wasn't afraid of me. It was just because I looked different, and I was taller, but now, she was practically cowering in front of me, just like the rest. Upon seeing this display of fear coming from her, I couldn't hold it back anymore. That was, among many other things, the final straw. The 3 days I spent dying at Black Mesa, all the regret and anguish, all the anger and sorrow, all the fear and fury, all the things that I had done, said, felt, and experienced, and on top of all that, knowing that I couldn't do a damn thing to save the people I came across in the fight for my survival, after being betrayed by the government I loved, boiled from me like a pot of water. I almost instantly broke down. My eyes filled with tears as they began streaming down my cheeks, as the images of faces of all those that I had left behind flashed before me. All that was lost came flooding back as I tucked my head into my hands and let my emotions flow. For the first time since Black Mesa, I began to cry. My mask and helmet came off as the tears flowed. I slumped over myself and cried away. It didn't matter who I was anymore, and I didn't care if anyone was watching. I needed this. I didn't even care if I was kicked out of the village to wander around this world till I died. Right now, right here, I needed this. And here I would stay as I let out a wail after wail of horrid screams. Feeling tears pool up in my hands as my fingers clutched to what hair I had left as they pulled away the strands in anger. I flung my head up, my face red. Yes, of course it's true. I was sent into that fucking hellhole, not to save anyone, but to kill. My fucking government signed the death warrants on all those fucking innocent people. And for what? Because they made a fucking mistake? It wasn't right. They didn't deserve any of that. Why? It's fucking bullshit. Why? I managed to scream out before I balled up even more and shoved my head into my PCV while I continued to cry my anguish away. I didn't care what I looked like anymore. I suddenly felt a pair of arms surround my body as the fluff of a Kieran's chest pressed itself into the side of my head. I felt the Kieran's chin rest upon the top of my scalp as they gently pulled me into a hug. At first, I didn't notice any of this, as I was too busy bawling my eyes out to feel anything. But as things got warmer around me, in a new, caring sort of way, I let my guard down. I felt the soft, almost velvety fur of Kieran's coat against my bare arm's skin. I could feel the blanket of warmth that the chest fluff was giving off to me. And finally, I felt the comforting security of a chin on my head. And finally, I heard a voice as I let my tears slowly drip to a halt. Shh. It's going to be alright, Adrian. Just relax, okay? You don't need to answer any more questions. Just relax and calm down. It was autumn, and as my tears slowed, and I regained my cognitive ability to realize what she was doing, I wasted no time burying my face into her shoulder as I wrapped my arms around her body. We just sat there as we held each other in both our arms. At that very moment, for a brief second, I could have sworn I felt a little drop of water on the back of my neck that slowly trailed down to my shoulders. I knew that it wasn't raining. It was a clear night. I stayed in this embrace for what seemed like an eon's worth of time, until I gave Autumn a tap on the shoulder, telling her to let me go. She complied with my request, and let me be as she leaned away, and the moment she let go, her hoof raced quickly to her eye, as she rubbed away at something. I gave her a nod of appreciation, and she gives me a gentle smile and a nod back. I turn away from her and back to the ground in front of me, just to regain my thoughts. I then glanced up at Fern, Petrus, Cetra, and Sylvana, who still looked mortified by this bombshell of information I had dropped on them. I let out a single dry chuckle and began to speak again. Black Mesa was madness, and now you know all the truth. But I'm afraid my story doesn't end there. Suddenly, Sylvana spoke before I could continue. Whoa. Hold on. You can't just drop that on us and then just carry on talking like it never happened. I don't know what kind of world you came from, but ours doesn't practice your level of violence, she says, stepping in front of the other three Karen as if to protect them, moving a bit closer to me. I want some answers. Autumn stepped forward, closer to me before I could say anything in my defense. Sylvana, calm down. Why are you jumping on him like that? She said as she defended me. Sylvana looked at her in shock. What do you mean? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? Why are you defending him? You heard what he said. He's murdered his own kind before. Innocent humans, no less. He's a murderer. She spat back, and yet again, before I could respond, Autumn stepped closer toward Sylvana, but even before she could speak, Sylvana spoke out, cutting her off. Just think of what he'll do to us if he deems us his next target. She glared down at me with a kind of hatred I hadn't seen in their kind before. I could have sworn I saw fire in her eyes, but that may have just been the fire in front of me. I stared back up at her, and was about to get up from my seat to speak, but once again, Autumn stepped closer towards me and spoke out. You know he wouldn't do that. Even if he's done it before, we've given him no reason to kill us, and obviously he's regretful for what he's done. I mean, come on. Those tears you saw weren't fake, and they weren't pity tears either. We can sense emotion, remember? It's the basis of our magic. Everyone here can. You're telling me that looking at him, you can't see some pony who's regretful for what they've done to his own kind? Sylvana quickly shot her eyes down at me, and I glared back at her. Our eyes met, and she stared for a few moments. As time passed, I could see her muscles relax as the anger on her face drained. She then took a step backwards and hung her head in shame. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking straight. I'm sorry, Adrian. I didn't mean to offend you. And she's right. Those tears were as real as they could be. I've just never been confronted with or heard of something like that before. I've never even thought that some pony could just do that to their own kind. She was quick to apologize. That was something I could respect, but she was right. You're right. I never thought that too, until Black Mesa, and technically, I never killed a single person while I was there. I only killed aliens and those who shot at me first. This was in fact against my orders, but at the same time, I never really got my orders to begin with. My Osprey crashed before my platoon commander could give them to me. All I knew is that my life and my fellow countrymen's lives were in danger of being compromised. So, I did what came natural to me, and I saved as many lives as I could, whether they were a scientist or a marine. It was my duty to God and country to save the lives of the innocent, and I was doing a great job at it. I made sure that the men and women I led to safety had an easy way to escape the facility before I moved on. But it was all in vain, I said, going to stare back at the ground. The Kirin returned to their seats as Autumn came to my side, wrapping a tender hoof around my shoulder to console me. I don't think I want to know why it was, but at the same time I feel compelled to ask. Why was it in vain? Fern asked with extreme caution. I glanced up at Autumn and smiled, giving her a gentle tap on the shoulder, letting her go back to her seat. I then looked over at Fern. You want to know why? It's because of that asshole. I paused as I could feel anger beginning to surface from a deep pit within my soul. That asshole in the fucking blue suit. Well, that was the chapter, everyone. I feel like I did a pretty good job on it. Not gloating or anything. I feel sick, though. Not gonna lie with y'all. That chapter kind of took a toll on me, which I don't feel heavy emotions really like that, or like usually. And sorry for not really posting much. Actually, I'm going to be doing 2 readings tonight. You will see as I'm going to post them probably within a very significant time frame of each other. And sorry with some of the names and how I messed up on them. I kept on changing, Salvata or some Shisa like that. I kept on accidentally, like, messing up her name because I don't know how to pronounce it. So, sorry about that. And also, as you'll tell, is I put a whole lot of heavier editing into it. I found good sound effects to put in, which I'm assuming you'll hear unless something messes up with the audio, which if so, please tell me and comment about it so I can fix it. But, yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the next chapter of Questionable Ethics coming out since it's been such a long delay, and yeah, that's really all I got before this becomes too long. So, everyone, have a good day and stay golden.